'Twas a long time ago, longer now than it seems, in a place that perhaps you've seen in your dreams, for the stories that you are about to be told began with the holiday worlds of old. Welcome back. Yesterday, upon the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. When I came home last night at 3, the man was waiting there for me. But when I looked around the hall, I couldn't see him there at all. Go away, don't you come back anymore. Go away, and please don't slam the door! Last night, I saw upon the stair a little man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away.
Have you ever heard of William Faulkner, the writer who is from Oxford, Mississippi? His house is called Rolling Oak. This is the story, the first and only time I will go to Rolling Oak. If you've ever heard many stories about Mr. Faulkner, you know he was a crazy man towards the end years of his life. It is said, and it is actually true, that he went so crazy that he wrote all over the walls in one of his rooms. I say this is true because you can go still see the writings. One day I was there and I was walking past that room. I felt a cold chill on my shoulder and thought nothing of it since it was mid of October. But then, as I was walking away from the room, I got groped by a ghost. It was the scariest shit you've ever seen or felt.
Mary was a quiet, nervous woman who kept to herself most of the time. She had grown up in a wealthy but cold home with parents who loved her but never really made any time for her. Despite her family's money, she only ever had 1 or 2 friends, none very close. She never really dated until she met Brad in college. He'd swept her off her feet in a whirlwind romance. He was perfect, patient and kind, and with eyes only for her. He never minded the way she locked and relocked the doors and windows of his apartment whenever she stayed over, the way she jumped at shadows and insisted the door of the closet be kept firmly latched, her intense dislike of anything horror-related. It took her a few months to open up to him about her night terrors and the fears she'd held close since she was a child, that something was watching her from the darkness of the shadows, that something was creeping in closets and lurking in the reflections of windows in the night. He was very understanding. After some talking, he managed to convince her it would be best if they moved in together. After all, if she were afraid of the night, wouldn't it make more sense that they lived together so she wasn't alone in it? His apartment was far too small for 2, and so he convinced her to rent them a house. For the first few weeks it seemed perfect. She worked during the day at a small used bookstore, not because she needed the money, but because she enjoyed the books. He spent the day setting up their place. It seemed completely peaceful, until he decided suddenly that he needed to contribute to the household. It was a wonderful gesture, in theory. They went to the bank to add him to her account and to set things up so he could deposit checks. Everything was going great until he accepted a job working overnight at the coffee shop near the college. He assured her it would be fine, that their place was secure enough to protect her from anything, and she believed him. After all, how much worse could it be than it had been alone in her old apartment? It started the first night he was gone. Strange noises from the ceiling in any room without a light on. Tapping from the other side of the windows. She was far too afraid to check. Scratching at the doors. She spent the first night awake, curled in their bed, the lights blindingly bright, her eyes unable to focus on the book she tried to read to calm her nerves. Brad assured her it was the same imaginary horrors that haunted her at her old place. She knew he was right. He had to be. But it felt different, more erratic, more real. So it went for a week. He would work, and the house would become a nightmare for her. She kept the curtains tightly closed, and for the most part locked herself in their bedroom, growing more and more exhausted. The first night she fell asleep, despite her panic. She woke with a start a couple of hours into her rest when her mind caught on to a new sound. The creak of the closet door opening. She pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a terrified cry as a tall shape unfolded from the shadows in the closet. A familiar horror. An unholy monster who'd haunted her childhood nightmares. It was tall enough it needed to duck as it slipped from the closet. Its shape was vaguely human, if you were to describe one to someone who'd never seen one before. Its limbs were all in the proper places, but far too long, and with joints that turned far further than they should have. Its long fingers tipped the claws that brushed its calves as it stood. It was darker than the shadows around it, light seeming to be absorbed into its darkness. It was watching her with large, shining eyes. Its long mouth turned into a slight smile. As it moved across the room towards her, its movements were unsettling. It was abrupt and jolting, but somehow she had the feeling it could move quite swiftly if it wanted to. She abandoned her sleeping pretense and scurried backwards on the bed, never looking away from the creature. She opened her mouth to scream, only to find her voice a ghost of a whisper.
No, you're not real. You're not real.
It stopped at the edge of the bed, only a few feet from her, its unearthly gaze never wavering from her face. Its mouth never opened, but it spoke, voices layered and slightly dissonant, of indeterminate gender, soft, as though it were whispering beside her ear. But we always have it. She whimpered, throwing out her arm to grab something from the side table, anything to throw at it. It shook its head, and she felt her arm fall to her side, her eyes growing heavier.
No, what are you?
She felt her body slide to the side, her head landing on the mattress as the world faded to black. The next time she woke was to see surprised Brad standing beside the bed. As soon as he saw her watching him, his frown vanished, replaced by a smile.
I'm so glad you managed to fall asleep.
She sat up abruptly, remembering the night before, and cast her eyes at the closet. It was closed tightly, but on the floor beside it gleamed the latch she'd added to it when they moved in. Things that night made for a new kind of nightmare. The tapping at the glass began just as it always did. Only this time, she didn't run to hide. She turned to Brad for help.
What tapping?
He asked with a frown, peering around the room. The tapping grew more erratic against the windows nearest to her, and she jumped, leaning nervously away from the curtain.
What's wrong?
She stared at him in disbelief. The rest of the night was like that. Noises in the attic, against the windows and the doors, none of which he heard. He humored her a few times and peered out the windows, even going outside despite her horror at the idea, to check. Still, he said, he never heard or saw anything. She was starting to think she was losing her grip. At his urging one night, she opened the back door after hearing what sounded like claws scraping against it, only to find a shadowed and empty yard. After that, she tried to ignore the sounds, assured she was imagining them. She would stay in the living room reading, trying to ignore the tapping, scratching, and occasionally loud thumping, until she was too tired from the strain of not reacting. Then she would crawl into bed and try to sleep. If at any point she opened her eyes in the night, she would see, standing close to the edge of the bed, the dark, twisted monster from the closet shadows staring at her. She would yell when it would let her. After a few weeks of Brad assuring her that he was proud of how she was dealing with her imagination and fears, she was starting to get better at ignoring everything. Everything but the thing in her closet. Somehow, she hadn't been able to bring herself to tell him about that one yet. Everything had settled into a routine, and she was finally starting to relax, until one night she woke with a start, much more sudden than any until that point. She tried to turn her head towards the door, only to find herself frozen in the grips of sleep paralysis. She opened her eyes, the only thing she had control over, to see the shadowed creature inches from her, along the side of the bed. It touched its long finger to its thin lips before sliding its hands under her body. If she could have screamed, she would have, but its powers had her locked down completely. It gathered her up, with a speed she had only suspected it was capable of, across the room and pulled her into the shadows of the closet. Her eyes darted in every direction as panic clutched at her heart. Her closet was there. She could see the edges of the walls. They were almost transparent, clouded by a dark, swirling mist. The creature set her down on something that, if it were her closet proper, would have been a pile of laundry. But here it was just soft ground. Her head was turned to the side by the movement, and she could see through the half-open door of her closet to her door and her bed. All around her, the shadows were moving. She did her best not to look too closely. Her heart raced. This was it. This was how she was going to die. Her creature unfolded itself back up to its proper height and turned its back on her, instead peering through the dark doorway and into her room. She attempted to make a noise and heard its voice again in her ears, much more angry sounding than the last time.
Silence!
Through the shadowed door, she watched as her bedroom door slowly pressed open. Her eyes widened in horror as a figure crept into the room through the door. Very human, very familiar figure. Brad moved quietly towards the bed, and the creature moved just as quietly through the shadowed door and into the darkness behind him. She wanted to scream, to warn him, and she struggled against the paralysis the creature had put her under, until the glint of metal in his hand caught her eye. A long knife glinted with the glow of the clock. She stared in horror as he lifted it, moving towards the bed she had been resting in moments before. She knew the moment he realized she was missing, the way he straightened up, the hand with the knife falling at his side as he puzzled over where she might be. Meanwhile, behind him, the jittering figure of her shadow creature began to loom. She watched with conflicted emotion as it reached out and plucked the knife from his hand. He spun and jumped back at the sight of the creature, his face a mask of horror as it held up the knife and studied it. It turned to look at him, and the knife turned to shadowed mist and faded to nothing. In her mind, she could hear its many voices, a taunting tone, mocking the man before it.
You think yourself a hunter? You're a poacher. You will not be tolerated.
Again, that hidden speed as it lashed out with a large hand, wrapping it around Brad's face and skull and yanking him back into the closet in the shadows beyond. It threw Brad into the mist surrounding them, and she watched as the movements around her suddenly stirred with interest, moving swiftly towards him. Her creature, when had it become that, she wondered, scooped her back up and slid her back into the room proper, depositing her gently onto the bed. Suddenly she could move again, but she felt exhaustion in every fiber of her being. What? She managed.
Sleep
Voices echoed quietly in her mind.
and remember.
It added as she drifted off. The next few days were a blur. At first, when she woke, she assumed it was a dream, until he didn't come home. She called his family and his friends, a few of which seemed extremely surprised to hear from her. None of them had seen him. She filed a missing persons report, but by now she was well aware they would not be finding him. The night she made the report, she found herself sitting in the middle of her bed in a dark room, staring at the closet. The shadows around the closet seemed darker and more active than they had any right to be. She could feel it watching her from the crack in the closet. The fear she had always felt of the dark was there, comfort from the hurt of Brad's betrayal.
I don't know why you saved me. I don't know why you haven't taken me too. But thank you. I haven't told anyone. I don't think they'd believe me, but I don't want to take the chance.
She felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, and she rolled her eyes, sliding back into the bed and settling under the covers. Her gaze remained on the swirling shadows in the corner, even as her eyes grew heavy. From the corner, the shadow's figure began to solidify, and she felt herself tensing as much as the hold of sleep would allow. It shook its head, a wider smile stretching its pale face, tips of sharp teeth showing past thin lips. It glided to its position beside her bed, its voice terrifying and reassuring in her head. And with a sigh, she did.
A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So, he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. The next night, his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked through the wide keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door out of curiosity, but decided not to. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked through the keyhole. This time, all he saw was red. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red color. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying on them the night before, and had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, he decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look through the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room, and her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red."
Haunted House by Jack Perlusky. There's a house upon the hilltop. We will not go inside, for that is where the witches live, where ghosts and goblins hide. Tonight, they have their party. All the lights are burning bright. But oh, we will not go inside the haunted house tonight. The demons, they are whirling, and the spirits whirl about. They sing their songs to Halloween.
Come join us. Come join us for the fun.
They shout. But we do not want to go there, so we run with all our might. And oh, we will not go inside the haunted house tonight.
The shallow, translucent waves broke calmly on the shoreline of the Rockport Beach in Presque, Michigan, as the night animals made their routine chirps and croaks under the moonlight. Frogs croaked and groaned in a faint symphony around the beach and its tree line further inland. Crickets joined in this ambient symphony of the dark. An owl would hoot occasionally, as if accenting the drum beats of nature's night song. The water's waves danced gently along the shore, though further out in the water, one could be conned into believing the surface were a thick sheet of impenetrable glass, casting prisms of white moonlight against the curvature of the sandbars. The only source of light in the entire area was the luminous, all-encroaching full moon, which only reflected upon the lake. If one were to hike over the small hill to the tree line, they would disappear almost immediately in a canopy of dense shadows. It was the perfect night for solitude, and, as evidenced by the solitary beam of light protruding from the sandy path further up the beach, one wouldn't be alone in making this assumption. The tiny beam of light bounced out jauntily from the path onto the beach, illuminating the caster of this technological spell, a shirtless young man with dark hair and wavy blue swim trunks. He appeared to be at least in his early 20s, barefoot, physically fit and cleanly shaven. Not a patch of hair blemished his defined chest, but his stubble showed in stark bumps against the light of the moon. He gripped his iPhone tightly and scanned the light along the beach. Not a soul in sight, he thought to himself. It's the perfect place to spark up. The young man tapped his pocket gently and strolled on. The young man continued down the shoreline, looking for a place far enough out to feel as obscure as he wanted to present himself. In wandering, he would notice the occasional flicker of forest life escaping along the beach. Small gray frogs, peep toads people called them, would jump out of the light's beam towards the forest here and there. A tan sand spider or three would dash away at the light vibrations of human footfall. Moths would occasionally jet across the stream of light as it crossed between the beach and their sporadic flight patterns. The night was alive and very much awake. He eventually found a spot by a short tree about midways down the beach, panned the flashlight around one more time to check for human life, and took a seat in the sand, pulling the twisted raw cone out of his trunk pocket. Finally, a place I can relax, he said to himself, as he pinched the J between his lips and struck the red Bic lighter. The flame illuminated his silhouette in an orange ambience against the sand as the joint began to ember. The young man's deep inhalations added to the ever-growing symphony of nature's night music, almost accenting the offbeats of the occasional owl. Damon had been through a lot today. He had worked his shift at the nearest tractor supply shop for over 12 hours today, tolerating every bark and bite his department manager threw at him. Lift this, move that, help this elderly lady reach the paint cans on the shelf, get off that fucking phone. Little did his boss know that he was trying to score a hot date with this girl he met at the gym the other day. She was lifting weights in the middle of the room directly across from the cushioned bench upon which he sat, also lifting weights. He looked her up and down, undressing her every defined plump curve in his mind until she caught him staring. "I didn't come to give you a show," she had told him. He merely said that he was admiring her lifting technique and that he wanted pointers. She didn't believe him at first until he started showing off his stance and techniques, giving each one a name that was either completely true or completely made up depending on whom you asked. They talked for a while, hit it off, then exchanged phone numbers. Fast forward to today, and she's saying she's not interested anymore because he won't talk to her enough. Those plans, like his hopes for a calm day at work, blew clean out of the window in an instant. The day's harsh words echoed one last time in his head before blowing away with the herbal smoke, rolling off his nerves like water from a leaf. Damon blew through half the joint before noticing his head start to fuzz and his vision start to sharpen the static in the air. I'm gonna give it a rest, he thought. I still gotta drive back. He stuffed the half-smoked spliff and lighter back into his pocket and glanced over at the water. The moonlight reflected in strips off the crystalline water, forming abstract hands in his mind, beckoning him to take a swim with their abstract fingers. Damon liked to go swimming as much as the next guy. There was something about this water tonight. Something different. The water carried an inviting energy that only increased as one stared at it. Gazing into the strips of light on the surface equated to staring into the eyes of a hungry anglerfish, with the swimmer being the fish. The thought of taking a dip appeared so refreshing in Damon's mind that he could actually feel the water ebbing and flowing through his brain, washing his worries out with the tides. He knew that it was a bad idea from the start to go swimming alone in the woods, but he made sure to wear his swim trunks just in case the opportunity presented itself. In this case, the opportunity presented itself like a roast suckling pig with an apple stuck in its mouth. Why the hell not, I guess, he said to himself aloud, as he stood up and began dusting off the excess sand from his trunks. The water was just so damn inviting tonight. After a day like Damon had today, washing off the stress seemed just as effective as smoking it away. He dug in his pockets, found his keys, lighter, wallet, and the half-smoked cone, and laid them on top of his phone underneath the small beech tree beside him. No cops here tonight, he reassured himself. There's no reason to be on a night this quiet. The 4th of July was still a couple weeks away, and the waters weren't yet ripe. The chill of winter's cold hadn't yet fully escaped Lake Huron, and the tourists couldn't yet stand it. Not to mention, pot was legal here. It had been for the last year, but many teenage memories of sneaking off behind the football field to smoke a badly ruled blunt still felt really fresh to Damon's mind, so he couldn't help but feel the least bit paranoid about the cops. Damon approached the water, glistening and gleaming through the night's darkness, and began slowly striding in. The water had that very distinct Michigan chill of early summer, bone-chilling, yet somehow delightfully refreshing. Having lived in this area his whole life, Damon had no issues getting used to the debatably frigid temperature. He let out a relaxed sigh and let his body fall into the dark blue blanket surrounding his waist. He made a small splash as his chest hit the water, and his feet jutted out from beneath him. He began slowly swimming further out while humming a song non-existent to the radio, but rather only existing in his head. Without a care in the world, he swam on, fully giving over to the gentle movements of the waves and the insulating coolness of Lake Huron. Damon swam, with frequent floating breaks, for what felt like an eternity. At this point, he had stopped caring about work tomorrow at Tractor Shithole, the future dirty looks from the gym babe, and about what time he needed to be home. All that mattered was what was happening right now, which was absolutely nothing. After a while, he stopped, righted himself in the water, and looked over his shoulder to see how far out he was. He almost gasped as he saw that the tree housing his personal belongings appeared as a tiny bug up on the shoreline. Have I really been swimming that long and that far? He tried to regain his footing on the sandbar, but then discovered that there was no sandbar beneath him. He could no longer touch the bottom. Guess I'd better get back, he said aloud with a nervous chuckle as he began slowly wading his way towards the shore. At this moment, a phantom spout of bubbles began brewing from a few feet behind them. Damon stopped short at the sound of the persistent bubbling and slowly began peering over his shoulder. The fuck could that be? He thought nervously. Is it a big fish? A ghostly corpse? I know the waters is supposed to be shark-free here, but what about ghost-free? As he looked over his shoulders, he noticed nothing out of the ordinary about the water, which held its glassed-over shine from earlier. The bubbles erupting from a few feet away reached the speed of boiling water, but never changed location or ceased their intensity. Damon slowly turned his head back around and took a deep breath, letting his hands float in the water. He was about to claim that it could have been the weed or even his imagination, until he gazed at where his hand should have been in the water, only to find a sinister, inky blackness tainting the reflective blue and obscuring his hand from the moonlight. He gasped and looked around himself, only to have a freight train of terror freeze his innermost heart and soul. The inky blackness that hid his hand had been pouring out all around him, surrounding his entire form and turning the moon glass surface to an impenetrable depth of writhing black. And even worse, it was getting bigger. Before Damon even had time to freak out and start thrashing about in the water, the bubbling behind him jetted out towards him at breakneck speed and charged right into the arch of his back. He felt the sickening thump against his back as he began to scream, only to be immediately pulled under with such a violent force that he felt his leg break and twist around at the knee. His scream was silenced in a sudden gulp, and then nothing more but bubbles. After a few minutes, all bubbling stopped and Lake Huron was calm again. The moon reflected its translucent pattern across the lake surface as before. The night's symphony continued with its frogs, crickets, and owls sounding off, almost unfazed entirely, with the exception of a patch of woods by the far tree line, where a menacing pair of large, glowing red eyes peered outward from the upper canopy of the trees. The figure within let out a slow, deep, gruff and grinding chuckle and vanished into the darkness, just as quickly as it came. This hot Michigan summer would indeed be one to remember, if anyone would be alive to remember it.
As it seems, our tales have come to an end. Are you scared yet? I hope so. It's been quite the year for scares. Be smart, or you could end up like one of these unfortunate souls. Happy Halloween!